This video is part of the GRESB Assessment Training Program. It will cover the structure of the Infrastructure Asset Assessment Performance Component. We'll start with an overview of how the Asset Performance Component fits into the GRESB Infrastructure Assessment. For an overview of the Infrastructure Asset Assessment, refer to the lesson titled Asset Assessment Structure. We'll explain how materiality-based scoring applies to the performance component. We'll review the use of exceptions and reporting boundaries in relation to the reported data, and we'll discuss external review of data. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to understand the structure of the indicators in the performance components of the infrastructure asset assessment. After this lesson, we recommend that you follow the lessons on the indicators in the performance components that are relevant to your entity. Let's start with a short introduction, an explanation of the aspects within the performance component and the various weightings that apply. As a reminder, the GRESB infrastructure assessment has two components, management and performance. The performance component measures the entity's performance, comprising information collected at the asset level. It is suitable for any infrastructure company with operational assets. There are 12 aspects in the performance component, which are further divided into 20 indicators, here represented by the green circles, 15 of which are scored. These indicators are presented in three different formats. First, there are the indicators that collect qualitative information. The implementation and certification and awards indicators are of this type. Secondly, there are quantitative indicators which use tables. These make up the bulk of the performance component. Output and impact, energy, greenhouse gas emissions, air pollution, water, waste, biodiversity and habitat, and health and safety are all indicators that have quantitative performance tables. Note that there are often additional non-tabular questions within these indicators that relate to the data reported in the tables. Finally, there are indicators that collect quantitative data, but in a non-tabular format. The aspects employees and customers are both of this type. The performance component accounts for 60% of the asset's GRESB score. The maximum score for certifications and awards is fixed at 2.9%, and the indicators in the aspects implementation and output and impact are unscored. All other aspects and indicators in this component are subject to materiality-based scoring. We'll give a brief explanation of how materiality-based scoring works in the performance component. For more information, we recommend completing the lesson on materiality-based scoring. GRESB's materiality-based scoring process applies the well-proven process of materiality assessment to scoring, thus ensuring that all assets are assessed and scored based on the ESG issues that are most material to their circumstances. This diagram explains the process, but we won't go into detail here as there is a specific lesson focusing on this. Essentially, completing the GRESB Materiality Assessment Indicator, RC7, determines the materiality or level of relevance for each of the ESG issues, and therefore 14 of the indicators in the performance component. These indicators each address one specific ESG issue, so the materiality weightings from the GRESB materiality assessment apply directly to the weighting of each whole indicator. This table shows an example of the application of materiality-based scoring to the performance component. You can see here that indicators relating to ESG issues of high relevance are weighted highly, in this case energy, and of medium relevance moderately, like greenhouse gas emissions, biodiversity and habitat, health and safety of employees, and customer satisfaction monitoring. Indicators relating to issues of no or low relevance are not scored. In this example, you can see that only 6 of the 15 possible indicators are scored. You may still choose to report data for the unscored indicators, if you know that your investors want to see such data, for example, but no points will be awarded. The weighting of the indicators is automatically redistributed to ensure that the performance component retains its overall weighting of 60% of the asset assessment. Both the materiality level and the maximum score, or weighting, will be shown in the portal at the top right for each indicator. So you should always ensure that you have completed the GRESB materiality assessment and all the entity and reporting characteristics before completing the performance component. This will ensure that you have the correct information for reporting throughout the assessment. More information on materiality-based scoring is provided in the Asset Assessment Materiality-Based Scoring lesson. Next, we'll discuss the quantitative performance tables. For the indicators in the aspects output and impact, energy, GHG emissions, air pollution, water, waste, biodiversity and habitat, and health and safety, quantitative data is requested in a tabular format. The tables all follow a similar format, with the metrics listed in the first column and their units in the second. The entity's data is reported in the other columns. The column Previous Year Performance is pre-filled with data from the previous reporting year. Where data is not available from the previous year, either because participants didn't report it or because the entity did not participate in the previous year, the metric will show NA, meaning not available. If a metric was newly added by GRESB, NA will also be shown. All data for the reporting year should be provided in this column. All quantitative data reported must match the metric and units provided. Negative values are not accepted. Data should cover the full reporting year and apply to the entire asset, including its reported ancillary activities. Any changes from these reporting boundaries should be reported under the question Exceptions, which we'll discuss later in this lesson. All cells with a green border are mandatory. That means that the indicator cannot be completed until a value has been entered. If you do not have a value for the mandatory metric, you should answer no to the overall question as to whether you can report performance data for this indicator. 0 is only an acceptable value if it is true, not in the case where the value is unknown. For example, if the entity has not purchased any renewable electricity during the reporting year, 0 may be reported for the metric purchased renewable electricity. The cells in the reporting year performance column showing the text NA in the portal are not for user entry but are calculated from data entered into other cells. They will show a value once the cells that are part of the calculation have been completed. The cells shaded green relate to the scored metric for the indicator. A score can only be obtained if the entity has completed the scored data cells. When a scored metric is calculated, the entity should enter values for the data cells that lead to the calculated value in order to obtain a score. Orange shaded cells are alternatively scored cells that are only scored for entities in certain sectors. For these entities, the green cells are not scored. Two types of targets can be reported: reporting year targets and future year targets. Targets are not calculated automatically by the portal. Reporting year targets are any targets that were set for the reporting year. They can be interpolated from a future year target. It is not mandatory to provide reporting year targets, but the reporting year target for the scored metric will be scored for completion. Future year targets are any targets that are set for a future year, so any year past the reporting year. Targets are optional for any metric, but green or alternatively orange shaded target cells will be scored. Only targets that are formally adopted should be reported. The future target year should be provided in the cell below the column header Future Year Target. We'll now discuss the reporting of exceptions to the reporting boundaries and the external review of data. Setting and describing appropriate boundaries for reporting on ESG is critical to allow data to be collected and reported consistently for an entity and to make comparisons between peers and over time. To this end, The asset assessment includes indicators that help to accurately describe the boundaries of reporting for each entity. These indicators are EC4 reporting year. This describes the temporal boundary for reporting. RC3 sector and geography. This includes the list of asset facilities with their geolocation, thus describing the physical boundary for reporting. And RC4 ancillary activities. This includes the list of ancillary activities undertaken by the entity, thus describing the operational boundary for reporting. The combination of these indicators provides an accurate picture of the reporting boundary. Everything within the boundary should be reported on within the relevant indicators, and everything outside the boundary should not be included. We recognize, however, that this reporting boundary may not apply to all reported ESG issues. For example, water data may not be available for certain facilities, even though energy data is. These exceptions to the reporting boundary must be described in the exception boxes included in the performance component indicators. All quantitative indicators include a question on exceptions to the reporting boundaries. First, state whether or not your data for this indicator matches the temporal, physical, and operational reporting boundaries previously described. If not, you must accurately describe any exceptions in the exceptions text box. Exceptions could relate to any of the boundary dimensions. Here are some examples which you may wish to pause and review. The response to this question is unscored and is for reporting purposes only. The indicators in the aspects energy, greenhouse gas emissions, air pollution, water, waste, biodiversity and habitat, and health and safety include a question on external review of the data. External data review adds credibility to data and makes it more reliable to use in decision-making. The review process must be completed by an independent third party, which is typically a consultancy or auditing firm. Externally checked means that the data has been reviewed in a structured and consistent process. Externally verified or assured means that the review process follows an existing scheme and is in line with the standards set by the scheme. It can only be completed by an accredited professional. Select the applicable scheme using the drop-down. The question on external review is not scored. Thank you for taking the time to complete this lesson. We hope that it helped you get a better understanding of the asset assessment performance component and prepared you to complete this component accurately. We recommend taking any of the lessons on indicators that are material to your entity next. If you have any questions, please contact the GRESB help desk at gresb.com/contact.